Gempur di Awani 7.45.
Keadaan Puan Seri agak lemah. Puan tahu ke Puan Seri ada penyakit?
Musibah yang dirahsiakan.
Dah jumpa ke cucu Mama? Dia masih tengah usahakan Mama.
Kesuntukan masa mencari pewaris.
I am strongly believe he is my grandson. Let's do DNA test then.
Ni awak dah jumpa Iman, sekarang ni awak nak buat apa?
Saya nak kenal dia lebih dalam.
Aku takkan biarkan kau bawa balik dak ni, Delia.
Pewaris Cinta, Isnin hingga Jumaat di Astro dan On Demand.
Sarawak disasar menjadi negeri pengeksport padi menjelang tahun 2030. Sekitar 200 penduduk kampung hampalan singgah mata Pulau Bumbum sempurna menerima bantuan pemeriksaan kesihatan secara percuma. Seterusnya, Kerajaan Sarawak menyasarkan ekspor pertama gas hidrogen pada tahun 2027.
Sabah Electricity Cenderam Berhad SASB mempertukar lebih RM500,000 untuk melaksanakan projek bantuan mesra rakyat BMR.
Manchester biru penuh muslihat, tiada kompromi. Sementara Manchester merah membara, menagihkan kemenangan. Apabila bertembung, medan pertempuran pasti hangat. Manchester Derby menanti. Premier League secara langsung di Astro.
Assalamualaikum dan selamat sejahtera. Anda sedang menonton Niaga AWANI bersama saya Nabilah Khaleeda. Seperti biasa, jam ini kita akan berikan laporan berita bisnes, kewangan dan juga ekonomi. Jadi kita mulakan dengan perkembangan ini. Berkuat kuasa hari ini, cukai jualan dan perkhidmatan SST akan naik ke 8% berbanding 6% sebelum ini. Bagaimanapun, kadar baharu ini tidak merangkumi perkhidmatan untuk makanan dan minuman, telekomunikasi dan tempat letak kereta.
Peningkatan kadar SST baru ke 8% ini diumumkan dalam pembentangan bajet 2024 Oktober lalu. Ia sebahagian daripada usaha kerajaan untuk meningkatkan daya tahan kewangan negara sambil mengurangkan defisit belanjawannya. Langkah ini akan membantu kerajaan terus menjana pendapatan untuk negara. Sementara itu, keputusan pengecualian bil air dan elektrik daripada kenaikan ini masih belum dimuktamadkan. Peningkatan kadar ini dijangka akan menambah hasil kutipan kerajaan. Tahun lalu, Malaysia sekadar mengutip kurang 30 bilion ringgit. Kutipan ini meletakkan Malaysia sebagai antara pemungut hasil cukai terendah di Asia Tenggara dengan nisbah cukai kepada keluaran dalam negara kasar KDNK berada pada 11.8%. Kementerian Kewangan telah menganggarkan tambahan 3 bilion hasil pada tahun depan dengan pelaksanaan kadar SST 8%.
Sejumlah 84.3% atau 6.96 juta pengguna kategori perumahan di Semenanjung tidak terjejas dan masih tidak dikenakan cukai perkhidmatan yang dinaikkan kepada 8% daripada 6% berkuat kuasa 1 Mac. Kementerian Peralihan Tenaga dan Transformasi Air Petra dalam kenyataan berkata, cukai perkhidmatan hanya dikenakan ke atas kadar penggunaan lebih daripada 600 kWh bagi perkhidmatan elektrik.
Jelas Kementerian berkenaan, sekitar 15.7% atau 1.29 juta pengguna kategori perumahan yang menggunakan elektrik melebihi 600 kWh. Berdasarkan jumlah berkenaan, pengguna kategori perumahan terbabit akan mengalami kenaikan bil bulanan antara 0.01 sen hingga RM45.48 sebulan atau sifar hingga 1.66% sebulan. Petra menambah subsidi yang dilaksanakan secara bersasar ini merupakan antara pendekatan kerajaan dalam memastikan subsidi diberikan kepada rakyat yang memerlukan. Pengguna turut disaran menuju kepada bil elektrik bulanan masing-masing bagi memantau penggunaan elektrik dan subsidi yang diberikan. Menurut peraturan cukai perkhidmatan pindaan 2024 yang telah diwartakan pada 23 Februari 2024, semua perkhidmatan bercukai disenarai dalam jadual pertama. Peraturan-peraturan cukai perkhidmatan 2018 akan dikenakan cukai perkhidmatan pada kadar 8%. Begitupun cukai perkhidmatan tidak akan dikenakan kepada perkhidmatan air dirawat.
Pembayar cukai individu dan selain individu boleh mengemukakan borang nyata tahun saraan 2023 dan tahun taksiran 2023 melalui e-filing mulai hari ini, 1 Mac 2024. Lembaga Hasil Dalam Negeri LHDN menyarankan pembayar cukai menggunakan perkhidmatan e-filing menerusi portal MyTax atau melalui portal rasmi hasil. Ejen cukai pula hendaklah menggunakan perkhidmatan Tax Agent E-Filing System atau TAEF versi 2.0. Pembayar cukai boleh membuat persediaan awal dengan mengumpulkan dokumen seperti penyata pendapatan, resit, invoice dan lain-lain dokumen berkaitan cukai pendapatan untuk memfailkan BN tahun taksiran 2023. Pembayar cukai berdaftar yang log masuk kali pertama ke MyTax perlu mengaktifkan sijil digital individu terlebih dahulu yang boleh dijana melalui portal MyTax. Maklumat lanjut berkenaan program memfail BN bagi tahun 2024 boleh dirujuk di portal rasmi LHDN. Baik, untuk waktu ini kita nak melihat bagaimana prestasi FBM KLCI sepanjang minggu ini serta unjuran hala pergerakan akan datang. Jadi kita bersama dalam talian ialah Syed Muhammad Kifni Syed Kamarudin, Ketua Strategi MIDF Research. Selamat pagi.
Selamat pagi.
Baik, boleh kongsikan bagaimana prestasi FBM KLCI sepanjang minggu ini memandangkan beberapa faktor mungkin mempengaruhi pergerakan pasaran saham?
Sepanjang minggu ini, indeks FBM KLCI naik sedikit sebanyak 2 mata kepada 1,551 pada penutup semalam. Namun pasaran equity tempatan diniagakan lebih tinggi pada awal minggu ini dengan indeks FBM KLCI naik menghampiri 1,560 mata pada hari Selasa lalu yang merupakan paras tertinggi semenjak bulan Mei tahun 2022 atau dalam tempoh hampir 21 bulan. Bagaimanapun faktor kemudiannya dilihat mendorong tindakan sebahagian para pelabur menjual pegangan mereka yang mengakibatkan penyesuaian indeks FBM KLCI dari paras tertinggi minggu ini. Tindakan sebahagian para pelabur bertindak mengambil untung itu tidaklah mengejutkan dan dilihat sebagai reaksi yang normal. Ini berikutan prestasi memberangsangkan yang ditunjukkan oleh pasaran equity tempatan semenjak awal tahun ini. Sehingga penutup semalam, indeks utama FBM KLCI yang mewakili saham syarikat-syarikat besar atau big caps mencatatkan kenaikan sebanyak 6.6% sepanjang 2 bulan pertama tahun ini. Dan perlu juga dinyatakan bahawa kenaikan harga di pasaran equity tempatan semenjak awal tahun ini bersifat agak broad-based atau menyeluruh. Ini kerana indeks saham-saham sederhana atau mid caps juga memperlihatkan kenaikan yang baik dengan indeks FBM 70 yang mewakili saham-saham syarikat besar sederhana naik 5.7% sepanjang tahun ini. Prestasi indeks utama pasaran saham tempatan yang naik 6.6% sepanjang tahun ini adalah lebih menyerah apabila dibandingkan dengan prestasi indeks pasaran-pasaran saham serantau. Ini adalah kerana indeks utama pasaran Indonesia JCI umpamanya hanya naik kurang 1%. Indeks saham Thailand SET turun lebih 3% dan indeks saham Singapura STI juga jatuh 3% sepanjang tahun ini. Indeks FBM KLCI juga outperform atau mengatasi jika dibandingkan dengan indeks-indeks utama antarabangsa seperti Dow Jones dan Europe Stock 600 yang masing-masing naik hanya sekitar 3% sepanjang tahun ini. Kami lihat faktor-faktor positif dalaman seperti tahap kemampanan ekonomi tempatan, prospek pertumbuhan keuntungan korporat dan juga valuation atau penilaian saham yang menarik sebagai pendorong kepada kenaikan harga di pasaran equity tempatan sepanjang awal tahun ini. Dan menyentuh tentang keuntungan korporat musim keputusan kewangan atau financial results seasons bagi suku keempat tahun 2023 baru saja berakhir semalam dan data menunjukkan adjusted earnings atau keuntungan dipinda bagi himpunan 30 syarikat-syarikat di dalam indeks FBM KLCI mencatatkan pertumbuhan tahun ke tahun 2 angka atau melebihi 10% bagi suku tersebut. Pada khidmat kami, ini merupakan keputusan yang menyenangkan pasaran. Manakala faktor positif luaran seperti bahayanya siri kenaikan kadar faedah dolar Amerika dan prospek siri penurunan kadar faedah oleh Rizab Kesatuan Amerika dijangka bermula pertengahan kedua tahun ini juga dilihat menjadi pemangkin kepada kenaikan harga saham. Dan seperkara lagi, kemasukan dana-dana asing ke dalam pasaran equity tempatan yang nilai pembelian bersih berjumlah lebih 2 bilion ringgit sepanjang tahun ini juga dilihat menyumbang kepada kenaikan harga di pasaran saham tempatan.
Baik, mungkin boleh kongsikan juga apakah jangkaan hala pergerakan pasaran saham dalam masa dekat?
Faktor-faktor positif dalaman seperti kemampanan ekonomi tempatan, prospek pertumbuhan keuntungan korporat dan juga valuation nilai saham yang menarik yang telah mendorong kepada kenaikan harga di pasaran equity tempatan semenjak awal tahun ini dilihat akan terus menjadi pendorong kepada kenaikan harga saham pada masa mendatang. Begitu juga dengan faktor positif luaran seperti jangkaan siri penurunan kadar faedah oleh Rizab Kesatuan Amerika yang dilihat akan juga terus menjadi pemangkin kepada kenaikan harga saham pada masa hadapan. Selain itu, kami menjangkakan nilai mata wang ringgit akan kembali mengukuh berbanding dolar Amerika dengan pihak Rizab Kesatuan Amerika dijangka memulakan siri penurunan kadar faedah pada pertengahan kedua tahun ini. Faktor ini dilihat akan mendorong lebih banyak pemasukan dana-dana asing ke dalam pasaran equity tempatan tahun ini. Namun perlu dinyatakan bahawa kenaikan harga di pasaran saham lazimnya akan berselang-seling dengan aktiviti pengambilan untung. Oleh itu, dalam tempoh dekat kami menjangka consolidation di pasaran equity tempatan setelah kenaikan harga-harga saham dicatat sejak awal tahun ini sehingga membawa indeks FBM KLCI naik sekitar 100 mata kepada paras 1,550 mata kini. Kami lihat konsolidasi harga-harga saham ini sebagai proses base building atau pembinaan dasar sebelum melonjakkan seterusnya.
Baik, itu dia perkongsian dari Syed Muhammad Kifni, Syed Kamarudin, Ketua Strategi MIDF Research. Segala perkongsian ini anda boleh dapatkan di platform astroni.com dan juga platform media sosial Astro AWANI. Jadi saya akan teruskan di mana hari ini berlangsungnya hari kedua Kongres Ekonomi Bumi Putera 2024. Jadi untuk kita ketahui apa yang menjadi tumpuan, kita bersama dengan Nina Rozman langsung dari Pusat Konvensyen Antarabangsa Putrajaya PICC. Nina, teruskan dengan laporan.
Baik, terima kasih Nabilah Khaleeda yang berada di pusat penyiaran Bukit Jalil ketika ini. Dan kini saya mengambil alih daripada rakan tugas Haris Ashraf yang telah membawakan perkembangan secara langsung pada hari pertama Kongres Ekonomi Bumi Putera KEB 2024 yang berlangsung selama 3 hari bermula 29 Februari sehinggalah 2 Mac 2024, iaitu di sini kalau bolehkan bawakan secara langsung di Pusat Konvensyen Antarabangsa Putrajaya PICC. Dan untuk hari kedua, mengapa saya berada di sini untuk membawakan anda secara langsung live feed ini, di mana kalau anda lihat di persekitaran dan di belakang saya tersedia banyak reruai booth di sini, dan iaitu ketibaan VIP, tetamu penghormat dan kenamaan yang sedang memenuhi Dewan Plenary dan juga Dewan, kita boleh cakap Dewan-Dewan di sini. Dan apabila kita melihat iaitu ramai orang yang berada di sini dengan membuat persiapan untuk menyaksikan sesi libat urus yang melibatkan antara 10 kluster sektor ekonomi yang akan dibawakan sepanjang 3 hari di PICC ini, dan setiap kluster atau sektor ekonomi ini akan dipengerusikan oleh setiap ahli yang dilantik oleh kerajaan untuk mereka membawa sesuatu resolusi yang lebih komprehensif dengan pendekatan pembaharuan anjakan, termasuk juga dengan penambahbaikan iaitu improvement terhadap permekasaan ekonomi bumi putera yang didorong untuk membawa hasil yang lebih adil, saksama dan juga inklusif. Sebelum saya kongsi lebih terperinci mengenai acara yang berlaku sepanjang hari kedua iaitu 1 Mac 2024, saya akan kongsikan sedikit rumusan ataupun recap perkembangan apa yang berlaku pada hari pertama KEB 2024 yang telah dibawakan dengan ucapan perasmian oleh Timbalan Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Dr. Ahmad Zahid Hamidi yang telah memberikan merasmikan iaitu hari pertama KEB 2024 di Putrajaya ini, diikuti juga dengan iaitu antara sesi-sesi perkongsian hasil sesi libat urus, di mana semalamnya antara sektor yang telah diberi tumpuan perhatian di PICC Putrajaya ini melibatkan reformasi pendidikan, modal insam, pasal daya saing dan keusahawanan Bumi Putra, termasuk juga dengan iaitu pendidikan TVET dan juga iaitu cerita-cerita daripada Felda, dan bukan sahaja memberi fokus semata-mata kepada Bumi Putra, tapi kita juga telah memberi fokus kepada ekonomi Bumi Putra Sabah pada hari pertama semalam, dan selepas iaitu pembentangan hasil sesi libat urus diikuti juga dengan iaitu segmen diskusi madani satu, iaitu yang telah kalau kita lihat iaitu antara segmen diskusi madani satu ini ada membawakan agenda atau mengenai aspirasi perpaduan mengukuhkan agenda Bumi Putra, iaitu dengan beberapa pelibatan daripada kementerian, termasuk dengan iaitu pembentangan hasil sesi libat urus, termasuk mengenai teknologi baharu dan iaitu tentang industri halal, yang juga merupakan antara matlamat Kongres ini untuk memperkasakan Bumi Putra dalam hasil teknologi baharu, termasuk juga dengan pelan futuristik untuk generasi akan datang. Dan apa yang boleh saya petikkan daripada ucapan Timbalan Perdana Menteri yang juga Menteri Kemajuan Desa dan Wilayah, beliau telah menekankan iaitu antara 3 matlamat KEB 2024, iaitu membawa kepada keadilan sosioekonomi, kemampanan negara bangsa, dengan yang ketiga matlamat yang telah diketengahkan oleh beliau adalah untuk kemakmuran negara dan juga kesejahteraan rakyat. Bukan sahaja 3 matlamat yang telah ditekankan oleh beliau, beliau juga telah iaitu membawa iaitu 6 tekad permakasaan Bumi Putra yang dibawakan oleh beliau dalam ucapan perasmian hari itu. Dan bukan itu sahaja yang kami bawakan secara langsung untuk lihat bagaimanakah perkembangan ataupun situasi di Putrajaya mengenai acara Kongres Ekonomi Bumi Putra yang berlangsung untuk hari kedua hari ini. Kita juga membawakan tetamu khas yang daripada semalam telah menyertai kami bersama rakan tugas Haris Ashraf yang telah bersiaran khas bersama ahli panel, yang mereka juga merupakan antara moderator pengurusi yang telah menyertai bersama kami. Dan semalam antara moderator adalah daripada Institut Pendidikan dan MARA sendiri. Mereka telah berkongsikan iaitu antara agensi-agensi kerajaan yang telah terkumpul di sini, bagaimanakah pencapaian mereka setakat ini dalam beri sumbangan kepada pembangunan sosioekonomi Bumi Putra yang mendorong yang lebih adil, sama dan juga inklusif, dan bagaimanakah penubuhan mereka, apakah mereka punya future plan bergerak ke hadapan. Dan juga kita dapat lihat peranan MARA antara perkongsian semalam sudah bersedia untuk memantapkan strategi untuk mengukuhkan lagi pembangunan sosioekonomi Bumi Putra Malaysia, kerana kita tahu MARA bertapak hampir di setiap negara di Malaysia. Dan itu adalah sedikit background mengenai acara ini dan rangkuman perkembangan yang boleh saya bawakan untuk hari pertama Kongres Ekonomi Bumi Putra. Dan saya boleh kongsikan sedikit sneak peek hari kedua ini, walaupun kita di sekitar awal pembukaan hari kedua ini jam 9 pagi, tapi kalau apa yang boleh saya kongsikan nanti kita akan lihat iaitu memberi tumpuan kepada sosioekonomi Bumi Putra Sarawak, juga permekasaan masyarakat asli, termasuk juga dengan penguasaan korporat dan juga kekayaan ekuiti yang akan diberi tumpuan fokus untuk hari kedua acara KEB 2024 di Putrajaya ini. Dan kalau kita dapat lihat iaitu antara diskusi madani kedua, ketiga juga akan melibatkan antara fokus kepada menoktakan kemiskinan, dan kita tahu lebih kurang jam 3 petang hari ini kita akan menerima ucapan oleh Timbalan Perdana Menteri iaitu Datuk Seri Haji Fadilah Haji Yusof yang akan memberi ucapan perasmian. Beliau juga antara merupakan iaitu Menteri Transformasi Air dan juga Peralihan Tenaga di sini, dan kita lihat akan lebih mendalam fokus mengenai peralihan tenaga dan juga penguasaan SME pada sebelah petang. Dan hari ini acara dijangka akan tamat pada pukul 5.30 petang. Dan ini adalah antara perkongsian yang dapat saya kongsikan sedikit untuk hari pertama dan hari kedua, dan banyak lagi apa yang akan saya bawakan mengenai sneak peek hari ketiga. Tetapi kalau kita tahu selepas ini, sebelum saya kembali balik kepada rakan setugas Nabilah, Khaleeda yang berada di studio, apa yang boleh saya kongsikan pada jam 11 pagi nanti kami akan bawakan tetamu yang akan menyertai kami. Beliau juga adalah antara moderator dan juga iaitu pengerusi antara salah satu kluster sektor ekonomi yang berada di sini, yang akan berkongsikan kupasan lebih mendalam mengenai bagaimanakah signifikan acara KEB 2024 kali ini dalam aspek iaitu reformasi pendidikan dan juga kita dapat fokus kepada modal insan. Dan jangan ke mana-mana, Harith, ini adalah perkongsian Nabilah, maafkan saya, Harith semalam. Ini adalah perkongsian yang dapat saya kongsikan setakat ini di PICC Putrajaya setakat jam awal 9 pagi, dan saya akan teruskan bawa perkembangan seterusnya di program ataupun buletin seterusnya lebih kurang jam 11 pagi, dan kita akan kembali studio.
Baik, terima kasih Nina atas perkongsian itu tadi untuk hari kedua Kongres Ekonomi Bumiputera 2024, dan perkembangan seterusnya akan dibawakan juga oleh Nina pada jam 11 nanti, pantau belanjawan. Jadi pada ketika ini kita akan teruskan dengan perkembangan GeoSME. Perkara berkaitan keselamatan menjadi keutamaan dalam masyarakat, khususnya keluarga. Rumah yang dilengkapi kemudahan dan keselamatan juga menjadi impian setiap pemilik rumah. Justru itu, syarikat membuat pintu pagar InnoGates yang bertapak di Taman Sri Pulai Perdana di Johor Bahru sentiasa membuat pembaharuan dalam setiap produknya.
Pengarah urusan InnoGates Trading and Services, Loh Mei Ki berkata, produk yang diperbuat sepenuhnya daripada aluminium ini mula mendapat tempat dalam kalangan masyarakat. Katanya dengan bahan yang lebih ringan, tahan karat serta reka bentuk pagar yang unik dengan penggunaan tanpa rel roda juga menjadi tarikan. Loh Mei Ki yang lebih mesra dengan panggilan Maggie mula menceburi perusahaan ini sejak 2 tahun lalu. Wanita berusia 36 tahun itu berkata kolaborasi bersama kilang di Melaka sentiasa mendorongnya untuk mencari inovasi baru dalam penggunaan pagar rumah. Hasil terbaru, ciptaan pagar kawalan jauh dengan menggunakan tenaga elektrik sehingga tidak memerlukan tapak getah di tengah-tengah bagi memberhentikan pergerakan pagar. Ia menggunakan sepenuhnya teknologi invisible stopper yang lebih selamat dan kemas.
Kami ialah fully aluminium trackless folding gate tak ada roda. Kedua, privacy concept, takkan tengok dalam, dan even dia punya tengah pun tak boleh tengok dalam loh. Ketiga, kami punya curve, kami itu frame buat curve macam 3D lah, takkan boring loh. Keempat ialah kami punya dalam punya motor. Motor ada 48 jam backup bateri dan panic alarm loh. Dan itu trackless system dan bearing, hinges, tiang semua memainkan peranan yang sangat penting. Latest dan last punya teknologi ialah unik teknologi lah, invisible stopper. Di market juga akan tengok itu rubber stopper on floor tetapi kami punya tak ada. Kami from 2019 kami sudah research ini invisible stopper lah in the market.
Walaupun baru setahun jagung dalam industri ini, Maggie mengakui peranan media sosial sangat penting dalam memperkukuhkan jenama syarikatnya. Malah katanya sepanjang tempoh perniagaan, dia mendapat pelanggan hanya dengan periklanan secara atas talian. Selepas memberi mutu perkhidmatan yang terbaik, katanya pelanggan akan turut bertambah dengan promosi mulut ke mulut.
From media sosial, Facebook dan Instagram, saya ada advertiser tolong saya advertise lah. Semua saya punya customer dari mostly lah from iklan, dan sekarang ialah customer intro customer lah. Media sosial sangat membantu saya lah. So saya punya customer pun a lot from iklan.
Maggie berhasrat mahu mengembangkan produknya bergerak ke hadapan. Bukan hanya sekadar pembuatan pagar rumah tetapi fokus kepada pintu keselamatan dengan ciri yang lebih inovatif untuk turut tersedia dalam perkhidmatannya. Bagi perancangan 3 tahun pula untuk memenuhi kehendak pasaran, pihaknya bercadang untuk membuka showroom InnoGates di Melaka dan Muar.
Satu nikmat yang besar bagi saya ialah masih diberi peluang untuk kita bersama-sama mengaji Al-Quran.
Manfaatkan masa dengan tadabbur.
Sebelum kita mati, kita bahagiakan orang yang kita sayang.
Ambo ke susu.
Senyum itu satu sedekah.
Kita dah halal dah.
Kisah drama penuh emosi.
Mohon petunjuk jalan yang lurus.
Sebagai panduan dan pengajaran.
Belajar berdamai dengan takdir.
Antara ramai-ramai diorang banyak mendoakan kebaikan untuk kita semua.
Menyantuni sesama insan. Dan mensyukuri nikmat.
Ha? Boleh? Benar, tuan-tuan.
Together.
Hargai setiap detik bermakna.
Masa adalah anugerah terindah.
Salam Ramadan Al-Mubarak dari Astro.
Alright, welcome back to Niaga AWANI. Continuing on, the shift in wealth to Asia along with investing trends have placed the spotlight and paved the way for Islamic Wealth Management or IWM to become more prominent on the financial landscape. And this is especially as the ASEAN 5, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore and Thailand, which are seeing a growth in affluence, have a significant percentage of the population that are Muslim. Hence, we are seeing some interesting developments. For example, Giant RHB's comprehensive IWM plan for the future, and now we want to know how it can actually benefit individual investor or even nation. So to discuss further, we have joining me in the studio this morning is Dato' Adi Sadikin Ali, the Managing Director and also the Chief Executive Officer of RHB Islamic Bank. Good morning, Dato'.
Morning. Assalamualaikum, Nabilah.
All right, to start, maybe you could share some insights on the performance of Islamic Wealth Management in Malaysia and how we can compare it to the conventional wealth management.
Okay, good question. But before I start, let me explain a bit about wealth management. Wealth management is not something new. It's been in the industry, financial industry, for quite a long time. But when we speak about Islamic wealth management, this is rather new and we are quite a nascent in that. Jadi kalau dari segi bahasa Melayu ya, kita panggil Islamic Wealth Management, kita panggil pengurusan kekayaan.
Kekayaan, patuh syariah.
Patuh syariah. Okey. Jadi kalau dalam perbankan industri perbankan Islam, mungkin selama ini penonton di luar sana mungkin pernah mendengar pengurusan harta, pengurusan wasiat, pengurusan kewangan Islam. Okey. Ini semuanya adalah komponen-komponen yang ada dalam Islamic Wealth Management yang kami perkenalkan sekarang. Maksudnya sekarang ni pengurusan kekayaan dari segi syariah yang kami bawa, ketengahkan adalah lebih terangkum. Yang bukan sahaja menitik beratkan pengurusan kewangan Islam, pewarisan harta, tetapi juga ada elemen-elemen lain yang kami ketengahkan sejajar dengan pelestarian kewangan Islam itu sendiri.
Mungkin boleh kongsikan dari segi perbandingan. Kalau kita tengok, kita ada juga risiko. Mungkin apa benda yang baru, mungkin kita boleh tengok dari segi risiko dan juga apa pulangannya, perbandingan pulangan dan juga mungkin dari segi perbezaan jangka panjang sustainability itu sendiri.
Okey. Sebelum saya jawab soalan tu, izinkan saya pergi kepada asas. Asasnya. Bila kita bercakap tentang pengurusan kekayaan, apa itu takrifan kekayaan? Okey, mungkin pada orang, ada setengah orang kata kalau dapat 1 juta baru kaya. Tapi mungkin pada setengah orang 1000 pun dah kaya. Kan? Jadi sebelum kita kupas lebih lanjut, izinkan saya mengatakan di sini bahawa untuk takrifan kami sama ada RM1 ataupun RM1 ataupun RM100 juta, itu adalah kekayaan. Okey, jadi untuk kami, hikmat nasihat yang kami berikan adalah kepada semua golongan masyarakat, bukan untuk T20, B40 ataupun M40. Okey. Jadi berasaskan kepada itu, di sini saya nak katakan konsep kami adalah berlainan daripada konsep pengurusan kewangan harta konvensional, sebab ianya adalah berasaskan kepada dasar-dasar maqasid syariah. Okey, mungkin saya terpaksa jelaskan maqasid syariah itu apa ya. Maqasid syariah kalau dari segi tuntutan Islam, okey, setiap orang mempunyai tanggungjawab pada diri sendiri, tanggungjawab pada Allah, tanggungjawab pada masyarakat dan tanggungjawab pada alam. Okey, jadi untuk tanggungjawab pada diri sendiri, salah satu tanggungjawab adalah menjaga harta. Right? Itu dalam tuntutan Islam.
Betul.
Jadi selari dengan nilai ini, asas ini, inilah di mana konsep pengurusan kekayaan kami yang dilandaskan. Itu perbezaan yang pertama yang memang jelas antara kami di perbankan Islam dengan perbankan konvensional. Okay? Jadi itu yang pertama. Dari yang kedua, dari segi pengurusan risiko. Okay? Setiap manusia dalam mencari kekayaan, pasti kita dalam melalui proses satu pengumpulan. Right? Kita kumpul daripada kita punya bisnes ataupun daripada penggajian, kita akan kumpulkan duit sedikit-sedikit. Tapi kita bermula dengan niat. Niat kita sebenarnya untuk jangka pendek, untuk keperluan, dan untuk jangka panjang, untuk menabung untuk masa hadapan. Sama untuk kita atau untuk keluarga. Kan? Itu niat kita.
Betul.
Jadi, dalam proses ini, sebenarnya proses itu panjang. Bukan untuk menabung, untuk mencari kekayaan sahaja. Di dalam proses untuk kami memberikan khidmat nasihat mengenai pengurusan kekayaan, ianya bermula daripada satu yang kita panggil penciptaan kekayaan. Kita kumpul sedikit-sedikit sampailah jadi banyak.
Betul.
Mengikut objektif kita. Tapi dia tak stop situ saja. It will not stop there. Yang kita kumpul itu, kita perlu pastikan ada pengurusan risiko. Biasa orang kadang-kadang melabur, kadang-kadang menyimpan, tapi kita tak tahu di tengah-tengah jalan apa berlaku pada kita.
Apa
cabarannya. Mungkin kita sakit. Jadi kita tak dapat meneruskan kehidupan. Jadi objektif kita mungkin terhenti di situ. Tapi sepatutnya mungkin kesedaran ini tak meluas. Sepatutnya perlu ada pengurusan risiko yang mana perlu ada kita subscribe to perkhidmatan macam takaful yang actually giving the cover. If anything happens to us, then that money is being protected and will be meant for our beneficiaries. Itu penting. Tak banyak orang fikir pasal itu. Jadi untuk kami adakan perkhidmatan pengurusan risiko dari segi melindung harta, melindung kekayaan. Yang ketiga, ini sama juga dari segi kalau kita orang Islam, setiap tabungan, setiap harta perlu disucikan. Kita perlu bayar zakat, sedekah, wakaf dan sebagainya. Jadi melalui pengurusan harta kami juga diberikan khidmat nasihat dan cara-cara untuk menyucikan harta. Dan yang terakhir, selalunya orang akan fikir kita ni lepas kita pergi, apa jadi dengan harta kita. Jadi perlu ada pengurusan pengagihan harta juga. Jadi empat elemen ini ada di dalam pengurusan kekayaan atau wealth management secara Islamik yang kami bawakan ke market. Itu memang berbeza dengan apa yang ada dalam konvensional.
Ya, itu bagusnya IWM ni ini merangkumi 4 elemen ni, jadi dah rangkumkan semua daripada kita masih hidup di dunia sehinggalah kita meninggalkan alam ini. Tapi kita nak tahu juga kalau kita melihat kepada potential investors, apa perkara yang kita perlu titik beratkan supaya mereka boleh melabur, terutama kita di Malaysia ni dengan jumlah penduduk Islam yang kita boleh kata signifikanlah jumlahnya banyak, dan bagaimana institusi kewangan boleh play a role ataupun boleh mainkan peranan untuk terus menambahkan jumlah pelaburan itu.
Okey. Dari segi pelaburan, sekarang ni kita tahu yang ada banyak rangkaian produk-produk pelaburan. Kan? Ada yang patuh syariah, ada yang tak patuh syariah. Tapi untuk konteks kita hari ini, saya akan cuma memberikan pendapat tentang yang patuh syariah lah. Okay? Ya, majoriti kita orang Islam di sini. Tapi produk ini bukan untuk orang Islam sahaja. Sebab objektif-objektif yang dibawa, yang diketengahkan bersesuaian juga dengan kod-kod etika, kod-kod matlamat dan matlamat-matlamat untuk normal investor. Alright? Jadi di sini boleh saya katakan, first of all, kalau dari segi pelaburan, orang akan lihat pulangan. Sebenarnya dari segi pelaburan Islam atau pulangan untuk produk-produk kami, ianya adalah sebaik sebaik konvensional, sebaik apa yang ada di luar sana. Jadi kita ni orang kata berdiri sama tinggi, duduk sama rendah. Itu dari segi pulangan. Dari segi pengurusan harta, pengurusan risiko. Juga rangkaian-rangkaian produk yang ada untuk protect the risk mitigation products, all there. Mungkin kita tidak berdiri setinggi mana konvensional, tetapi boleh saya katakan sebab saya dalam industri perbankan dah lama juga, kita ni menghala ke arah akan duduk yang sama di tahap yang sama dengan konvensional, tidak jauh. Jadi pengurusan dari segi pulangan pelaburan kita mungkin sama, kita sama. Dari segi pengurusan risiko kita we as good as
sama juga
as them. Kemudian dari segi potensinya memang besar sebenarnya. Kalau kita katakan dari segi market kita jangkakan di sini di Malaysia paling kurang antara 350 bilion ke 450 bilion. Tapi setakat ini mengikut statistik yang kami ada, yang aset-aset di bawah pengurusan industri kewangan Islam dari segi pengurusan harta tak banyak. Mungkin cuma 1.2%. Jadi jauh lagi potensi yang ada. Jadi kami rasa terpanggil macam hari ini saya di sini adalah untuk memberikan berkongsi, mewarwarkan, berkongsi sedikit maklumat supaya awareness amongst the public, especially the Muslim, is heightened. Right.
Tapi dari segi dari pihak RHB sendiri, mungkin kita tahu keperluan pelanggan atau customer ni berubah mengikut peredaran semasa. Jadi bagaimana, apakah antara strategi ataupun inovasi yang boleh RHB lakukan untuk kita terus memenuhi keperluan pelanggan ini bergerak seiring dengan bukan sahaja pergerakan teknologi tapi pergerakan orang kata ekonomi juga. Jadi macam mana, apakah peranan RHB untuk merealisasikan impian setiap pelanggan?
Okey. Bila kita bercakap tentang pelanggan, seperti Nabilah kata tadi, ia bergerak seiring dengan masa dan juga kalau dari segi demografinya, pelanggan kita bermula daripada bawah sampailah ke atas dari segi struktur ekonominya, dari segi umurnya. Jadi untuk kami, kalau biasanya dulu when you talk about Islamic wealth management, people akan kata ini cuma produk-produk untuk orang kaya. Kan? Nama dia pun pengurusan kekayaan. Tapi sebenarnya ianya bermula daripada bawah. Sebelum kita mungkin kaya itu relatif kan, tapi mungkin sebelum kita kata kita kaya, kita start from zero. We're building. And chances are bila kita build itu ia sejajar dengan usia. Jadi untuk kami lihat pelanggan kami bermula daripada awal sampailah kami bawa ke yang mungkin akan sampai ke status yang tinggi yang kita panggil pelanggan mewah, dan dari segi umur akan sampai ke umur yang mungkin lanjut. Okey, sebab itu yang seperti saya katakan tadi, the segments that we have will be tailored towards the needs, pengumpulan harta, penyucian harta, pengagihan harta, dan throughout it's all about protecting the harta. Okey, produk-produk kami memang untuk setiap segmen, setiap sektor, we ensure that we have the right product for the right market.
Jadi moving forward, bergerak ke hadapan ni adalah perancangan sekarang seperti yang kita kongsikan tadi, tapi untuk bergerak ke hadapan mungkin dari segi peringkat kerajaan, apakah dasar polisi mungkin kita boleh terus menarik minat orang ramai bukan sahaja di peringkat domestik tapi di peringkat luar juga, bagaimana untuk kita teruskan perkasakan atau memberdayakan IWM ini?
Okey. Kita tahu yang sebenarnya kerajaan daripada awal tahun 80-an memang ke arah menjadikan Malaysia ni sebagai satu pusat kewangan Islam. And to a certain extent we have achieved that for quite a while. We have been, kalau dari segi ranking pusat kewangan Islam, kita kalau bukan tersohor, kita mungkin dalam top 3. Okey. 3 ke atas. Jadi untuk mencapai status itu sebenarnya ianya bukan dari segi slogan saja, sebenarnya ketersediaan kita dari segi produk, dari segi offerings, dari segi the technical sides, orang-orang yang menggerakkan, kita memang ada di situ. Dan dari segi market pun, kalau kita tengok perbankan Islam ni ataupun produk kewangan Islam di Malaysia ni bukan satu yang barulah. Nothing is not alien. Even kalau saya boleh kongsikan di RHB Islamic, setengah daripada pelanggan kami adalah bukan Islam. Okey. Jadi penerimaan tak jadi masalah. Cuma mungkin market di Malaysia ini kecil, kan? Jadi kita mungkin perlu luaskan keluar. Tapi sebelum kita keluar, kita akan pastikan yang awareness on the Islamic wealth management, terutama di kalangan Muslim, adalah mungkin menjadi lebih besar. Dan kami pemain industri termasuk RHB Islamic ini memang bertanggungjawab untuk mengketengahkan produk-produk yang berpatutan, yang suits the needs of the customers, to ensure that Malaysia akan menjadi hub kewangan Islam seperti mana yang disarankan oleh kerajaan lah.
Baik, itu dia perkongsian dari Dato' Adi Sadikin Ali, Managing Director dan juga Chief Executive Officer RHB Islamic Bank, dan kita harapkan kerjasama antara pelbagai pihak untuk kita merealisasikan sasaran untuk menjadikan Malaysia sebagai hub kewangan antarabangsa. Baik, sebelum kita berhenti rehat, kita ikuti rakaman temu bual Nina Rozman susulan laporan Bank Dunia sebelum ini. Jadi silakan.
Alright, the World Bank just launched its latest report with the theme Informal Employment in Malaysia, looking at trends, challenges and opportunities to reform. And the report and policy briefs aims to fill the knowledge gap about informal employment in Malaysia and how suggested policies and to better protect, enhance the productivity of the workers in this sector. And we have our guests to discuss a bit further about this report. We have here is Dr. Yashodhan Gorpada, the Senior Economist, World Bank. I want to say thank you very much for joining me. Congratulations on the latest report. Maybe you can share with us maybe some of the key takeaways from this report.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. Now, informal employment in Malaysia is something that is of much concern to all members of society and for policy, because informal employment, if we understand it as basically employment which does not have standard protections that many of us have in our regular jobs, jobs that don't necessarily have pension contributions or protection against risks. This is something that is of concern in Malaysia, because while some types of informal employment, such as farmers and street vendors and hawkers, those numbers over time have been going down, and we see that quite clearly. Other types of informal employment, especially in the gig economy and through digital platforms, those are beginning to rise. And then this raises a question about, are workers in informal employment, do they have enough protection, or are they sufficiently productive? These are questions we delve into the report. And we find that while informal employment overall is declining, there are still important gaps to be filled. Protection needs of workers need to be met, because informal workers are exposed to many different types of risks. And we mention a few policy recommendations for how these risks can be mitigated.
Talking about the informal employments, maybe you want to check on what are the specific or certain challenges faced by informal workers in terms of access to social protection and even labor rights.
So absolutely. Now, informal workers are typically out of the fold of social protection programs. They do not have EPF or SOCSO contributions for the most part. Some of them may do, but not enough coverage. And this contrast this with the fact that they actually face many different kinds of risks and shocks. So their incomes are not very stable. They don't have a fixed monthly salary that many of us otherwise may have. Their incomes are very volatile. They face lots of risks of injuries and of health-related issues. So there is certainly a gap between the vulnerabilities they face on the one hand and the lack of access to social protection for them.
Talking about the informal employments, maybe you want to check on what are the specific or certain challenges faced by informal workers in terms of access to social protection and even labor rights.
So absolutely. Now, informal workers are typically out of the fold of social protection programs. They do not have EPF or SOCSO contributions for the most part. Some of them may do, but not enough coverage. And this contrasts this with the fact that they actually face many different kinds of risks and shocks. So their incomes are very volatile. They face lots of risks of injuries and of health-related issues. So there is certainly a gap between the vulnerabilities they face on the one hand and
I'm definitely talking about to strengthen the protection for the informal workers and to enhance their productivity. We need to know what kind of impact this informal employment bring to the country. So how does informal employment impact the overall economy and the well-being of Malaysia?
So in our analysis, we found that the informally employed workers actually tend to earn much lesser than formally employed workers, even if they have the same education, the same age, same gender, same location, same industry. So being informally employed actually means on average workers are paid lesser. Their work does not bring them as much money as they would in a formal job. They also don't have enough protection against the kinds of risks they face in their work. So from a social point of view also, this is also quite concerning because we're talking about large numbers of people whose income is very volatile, it's generally low, and they also face risks around health, around insufficient incomes, around the variability of incomes. So it's certainly a concern for the economy.
Within the reports, we can also see the recommendations for the policy for the informal worker, and we want to see what are the current initiative or policies that have been implemented to address to the informal employment in Malaysia, and maybe share some what the outcomes have been.
Right, so certainly agencies such as SOCSO and DPF have particularly launched specific programs for supporting the informally employed. The ISARAN is one such program which allows voluntary contributions for social insurance coverage. This is something that's certainly seen with a lot of interest, not just for us in Malaysia, but also it's an interesting case study abroad. But the challenge here is to try and evaluate some of these initiatives a little more carefully so we can learn a little bit more about them. But we certainly feel that some of the initiatives around voluntary contributions, which is a big challenge, but allowing voluntary contributions for EPF and SOCSO coverage is a very welcome policy initiative undertaken by the government. That said, our report also shows that although these initiatives have been launched, their take-up remains somewhat low. So, they're welcome initiatives, but we need to understand why not all workers are still able to access them, and going the last mile and reaching the majority of workers remains a challenge.
And talking about other challenges, how does informal worker intersect with other socioeconomic issues like poverty, gender inequality, and rural-urban disparities?
So certainly there's a lot of analysis that we did around these questions. So we cannot, in fact, take away the issue of informal employment from these other structural issues that we mentioned. So in our analysis, for instance, we find that older workers are generally more likely to be in informal employment as a whole. So there is an age dimension to this, but there is also a poverty dimension because we find that the rates of participation in informal employment is much higher among poorer households. So it is very closely linked to poverty status. A large number of the informally employed are in fact poor. So we have to really take more of this granular analysis. I can go on about some of these details. We also find, since you mentioned gender, for instance, that women in informal employment are paid on average much lesser than men who are also in informal employment. So the wage gap by gender in informal employment is also a matter of concern. We explore these and other aspects that you mentioned, differences by rural, urban location and so on, and there's a lot more information in our report on precisely these questions.
Definitely there's a lot more to look at other of this aspect, and we want to talk about going not only to protect the globalizations, technological advancement like AI, we know that impact. How does this impact the dynamics of informal employment in Malaysia?
Well, that's a very good question, and there's no straightforward answer to it, because on the one hand, we could think of different types of technological developments, AI and others, also replacing the need for informal employment. At the same time, these technological advancements can actually make it easier for us to be able to extend the reach of social protection programs to the informally employed. It's also possible that those who are informally employed can even benefit from some of the new emerging technologies, generative AI in particular, to improve their productivity on their jobs. So a lot depends, on very specifically what the technologies are used for. But of course, we have to wait to see what exactly will be the effects. But we can estimate, we can expect, both positive and negative effects.
And what can also we learn from other countries' experiences in tackling the informal employment, and how are they applicable in the Malaysian context?
So the Malaysian context is quite unique in many ways, but at the same time we have tried to see as much as possible the extent to which successes in other countries may be applicable in Malaysia. But if I were to just say very broad principles and not very specific policy recommendations, I think effective but limited regulation is useful. It is useful to have a wider variety of choices for social insurance coverage for the informally employed. And Malaysia is actually quite well placed to do that. And in fact, we often share some of the examples of Malaysia with other countries. But I think where certainly more can be done is on linking the social protection programs with social insurance programs to make sure that none of the informally employed workers fall between the cracks. So there is a better linkage between EPF and SOCSO on the one hand, but also on the cash transfer programs on the other, so that the informally employed workers can benefit from coverage from both as needed.
All right, we're on year of 2024 and the stronger recovery phases from the pandemic COVID-19. How do you foresee the future of informal employment in Malaysia, maybe on the near term or even the long term?
So from the data that we've been looking at, there has been a secular decline in the overall rate of informal employment. We probably expect that that will continue. At the same time, some newly emerging forms of informal employment, particularly in the gig economy, would probably rise. And even in the most advanced countries, we see that there is some prevalence of informal work, particularly in the gig economy. We suspect that that will probably remain, but more than speculating on just the numbers and the trends of overall informal employment, we'd very much like to focus on the issue of the protection and productivity of the workers. That, in fact, has been central in our report. And we'd like to move a little bit away from the focus on just numbers overall for multiple reasons. And, as I mentioned, turn the focus on protection and productivity needs of those who are informally employed.
All right, we're hoping for all the policy recommendation and the current policy are able to strengthen the protection for the informal workers and also enhance their productivity. And I will say thank you very much to our guest, Dr. Yashodan Gorpada, the Senior Economist, World Bank, and also the author of the World Bank latest report of the informal employment in Malaysia, Trends, Challenges and Opportunities to Reform. And for those who you missed out on this discussion with the Senior Economist, Dr. Yashodan, you can see all the discussion will be featured in all AWANI.com and all our social media platform. I'm Nina Rozman. Catch you on the next.
Asia tumpuan utama dunia. Dengan ekonomi yang semakin rancak, pembangunan lestari dan tenaga boleh diperbaharui, apakah pula impak kecerdasan buatan AI dalam perkembangan teknologi dan masa depan pekerjaan? Kami mendalami setiap berita dan cerita. Saksikan diskusi, dialog dan laporan khas di Agenda Awani Asia bersama koresponden khas kami setiap Sabtu 9 malam di semua platform Astro Awani.
Kau ingat aku nak tanggung lagi kau ke lepas bapa kau mati ni?
Takdir membawa dia pergi.
Mingguan minta tolong dengan Cik Arman. Siapa Cik Arman?
Pergilah, mampus. Ni bas kau pergi KL.
Betul Kak tolong dia nak Kak. Kenapa? Buat kita kawan ke? Dia ikut dia daripada tadi.
Adakah ini ketentuannya?
Dia tak sampai rumah kawan dia Mariam ni kot. Sudah.
Kak Dan masuk ke jari ni ke?
Dian.
Takdir itu milik aku. Di Astro dan On Demand.
Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tehmina Kaoosji. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in business and future affairs, market watch, industries, analysis and insights. We've got you covered right here on Niaga Spotlight. Well, today on an analysis segment, we're actually looking at a very interesting topic, which is environmental economics as well as climate action. Now, it's been very interesting to note that the Malaysian government has actually been calling on the private sector to view decarbonization as an essential long-term corporate strategy to help boost not only economic growth, but at the same time as the nation shifts away from fossil fuels. The National Energy Transition Roadmap, or the NETR, now actually states the aim to derive 70% of Malaysia's energy supply from renewables by 2050, which is actually an upscaling from the previous goal of 40% by 2035. So, this plan identifies 10 projects which are actually aimed at achieving this goal, including the construction of renewable energy zones and creating demand for biomass. Niaga Spotlight today will be highlighting perspectives on how both big business as well as the average Malaysian can actually contribute to ensuring that decarbonization occurs both on a corporate as well as a personal consumer level. To get an overview of environmental economics, first and foremost, a branch of economics that focuses on the relationship between economic activity and the environment, I had the pleasure of speaking with Associate Professor Dr. Santa Chanaya Ramu with the Department of Economics at University Malaya. Let's watch. Dr. Santa, thank you so much for making time to join us on Niaga Spotlight. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for inviting me. It's indeed a pleasure.
Dr. Santa, so if we could get started off by me asking you about correlating environmental economics to the fact that Malaysia's FDI has definitely been growing steadily over the past decade. Recently, it increased to 926.3 billion ringgit at the end of the fourth quarter of 2023. Now, based on available studies, Dr. Santa, how does increasing levels of FDI into a country correlate with environmental performance?
This is a debate, right? This has been a debate, a long debate, I would say. FDI definitely contributes to development, economic development. Of course, there are many other studies that show that it leads to degradation and so on, but let's look at the positive side first. The first one, if you allow me, definitely it improves the environmental performance, right? Even though we are talking about investment, FDI, but it depends on where FDI is actually pumped in, right? So based on that, there's definitely a technology transfer. We can say technology transfer, capital infusion, adoption. If you want to adopt cleaner production processes, you definitely need FDI. So from that point of view, FDI definitely is contributing to the growth of an economy. But we have to agree that there are negative impacts on the environment. It cannot be denied, right? Some of it is overuse of the land, leading to environmental pollution, waste not managed properly, to name a few. So definitely, this is a long ongoing debate, right? Even from the theory of environmental Kuznets curve, if I were to talk about that, people wouldn't understand. Let me talk about in the layman term. Definitely, in the early stages, you have to allow for development, right? And then eventually, like when you see countries really doing well today, like the developed countries, definitely now they're doing very well in terms of environment. They're able to balance. It's countries that the developing countries are still struggling to balance between growth, economic development, as well as to ensure or to minimize the environmental degradation.
Sure. So we're talking about also minimizing environmental degradation, right? So now, according to research both locally and abroad, Dr. Santa, it has also been found that the higher the FDI into a country, the higher the environmental degradation. And Malaysia in particular, this is connected to growth in the manufacturing sector. So what have been some of the major environmental costs of FDI to Malaysia? And perhaps what are some core approaches or policies that can help shape a more positive impact of FDIs into Malaysia?
Yeah, it depends on where this FDI is pointing to. So if you talk about industries like palm oil, right? If you think about palm oil or mining, right? Definitely leads to deforestation and habitat destruction in Malaysia. There are many studies that depending. So this is palm oil. But when you talk about manufacturing, right? If you talk about manufacturing, we have to talk about pollution, right? Air pollution, how water is polluted. All depends on how firms are actually dealing with this environment. Many of the firms, what they do is environmental cost is an additional cost for them, right? So they try to evade from this cost. So therefore leading to serious air as well as water pollution. When you talk about, there are also FDI on tourism, right? If you talk about coastal development projects, then there are loss of coral reefs, marine life. So it depends on where it is pumped into. So if you ask me, the main would be pollution. How do we deal with this air as well as when water is polluted, right? And then overuse of land, when exploitation, because there are, if you ask in the case of Malaysia, we do not have a proper regulatory system. We have some system. If you ask me a proper regulatory system, or the transparency of the system, it's not clear. So therefore, definitely the impact on the economy is there, right? How do we deal with this climate change? Eventually, when you talk about air pollution, water pollution, all this will lead to the climate change, right? What's happening?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if I may ask you over there, speaking of a proper regulatory framework, Dr. Santa, what would an ideal one look like? And also in line with, of course, Malaysia's broader NETR, the National Energy Transition Roadmap. So how do we integrate all of this and make it happen on a much more, I would say, escalated timeline, considering the fact that FDI continues flowing in? We're, of course, having a lot more development, but we do need to be able to deal with environmental degradation while it's happening rather than wait till the end cycle of the FDI to be seen through, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because government are taking initiatives, but definitely when it comes to environment, the incentive base will not really, it works. I mean, like if you talk about taxation or subsidies or whatever, it does work. But when it comes to how serious the environmental issues are, I would think that a command and control type of approaches, I talk about stringent environmental regulation and enforcement, that is needed, right? That would definitely bring towards the change. For example, let me talk about how do we stop or ban the usage of plastic bag, or how do you reduce the usage of plastic bag? We know that plastic bags can't be recycled. It takes hundreds of years for it to degrade or whatever. So those kind of issues, you need command and control. You need a regulatory framework. You need a complete ban. Like Europe, complete ban. There are some countries that have stated, like India, complete ban. They don't use plastic bags at all. You don't go for incentives. You say, oh, you try to reduce stuff. It doesn't work in some of the environmental issues. You want to, if the issue is really serious, what you need is a proper regulatory framework, right? Where you need intervention of government, definitely. It has to come top down, actually.
So how can we actually ensure projects with potential high environmental impact are conducted transparently by the government and majority stakeholders, such as the developers, with the participation of the rakyat, outside of just having, perhaps stakeholder discussions? How can we ensure that the process, once it gets into the actual development of mega projects, is also transparent for environment?
Yeah, that's really tricky because you can't satisfy everyone. I mean, the one that I've participated is like FGD groups where they call everyone and we give our views. But my worry is whether our views are really taken into account, right? We want to know, like, after, what happens after? Like, they have this discussions, they want to know what's our perception. We want to know what happens after that, right? Probably what can be done is to make it transparent what happens actually, how our views are actually taken into account and whether it's really incorporated, right? Because if not, there's no purpose, I feel, in the process, right?
Mm-hmm. Precisely. Thank you very much, Dr. Santa. It's been a very valuable insight to get a little bit of information about environmental economics and how it's actually working on the ground when it comes to actual projects and, of course, FDI investments. We'll go for a short break now. We'll be right back with Niaga Spotlight.
Gempur di Awani 7:45.
What a start to the season!
Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight. You're still with me, Tehmina Kaoosji. We now shift the conversation to looking at environmental economics and climate action on a more individual level, with perspectives from Melissa Tan, climate action and sustainability advocate, joining me live in the studios. Melissa, how are you this morning?
Excellent. Super excited about this conversation, Tehmina.
Fantastic. So, of course, I know a fair bit about the work that you do and the causes that you advocate for, but now let's look at it from a more wider perspective and boil it down to looking at hidden environmental costs of the green transition. So you have also been advocating for and living what we could call perhaps a zero carbon lifestyle for quite a while now. Tell us a little bit more about this.
Okay. I guess with the green transition, sometimes you might look at it a little bit too surface level, and that's where people start to approach this topic at first, which is, oh, all it means is we're just going to switch everything to renewables, right?
Right.
But it's actually about changing up and transforming how we're running the economy and how we actually live at this moment. It's a cycle of overconsumption, overproduction, everything's done at speed. Instead of really valuing what is it that we need to shift, that isn't just about, hey, everything's just now on solar. So with the green transition, obviously, there is a lot of push for governments, communities, businesses, individuals to go low carbon or net zero.
Sure.
But that isn't just at consuming at the speed that you are at right now, wasting at the speed that you are at right now. It's just that now everything was powered by solar. Because there is a lot of pros and cons to the renewable sector as well. If you try and meet and match that demand of energy, just by replacing it, there is a cost of that investment to being able to provide that to the world as well. For example, with solar panels, you will have things like having to extract rare earth minerals, do a lot of mining for precious metals, to be able to build all those solar panels, to build and clear those football fields, to place all those solar panels. How would you change the grid and how it runs to be able to meet an ever-increasing demand? What about if we actually reduce demand, change the way we lived instead? Consumed in a way that met the welfare and well-being of everyone, and then have the renewable sector support that.
Right. So I love the fact, Melissa, that you really honed in on what is often quite contested, because when it comes to the transition, of course, we're going to be needing billions of dollars, USD we're speaking over here, globally, for this transition to happen at all. not only about Malaysia particularly, but I really want to hone in on what you spoke about, looking at overconsumption and the hidden environmental costs. So when was it along in your journey that you became interested in reducing personal consumption, looking at just how one lives their life day to day? And how did that become kind of integral to you being a more green individual?
I suppose it comes from first the love of nature, the love of all living beings, and then seeing your personal impact to the world around you. I think we all get introduced to the concept of environmentalism and acting in the favor of our planet through recycling. So when I first, as a kid, just actively recycling and believing that was the way forward, that was the way of being a responsible citizen, a responsible human being that is trying to create as much good and as little negative impact as possible. And then to find out later as an adult that recycling is more often than not just a veil, a sham, that is kind of subverting you away from what the real deal is, which is the way that we live right now is problematic. And recycling isn't going to solve that. So then driving to the root of the problem, what is it that has kind of twisted the way that we run our lives and run our worlds? And how can we then shift away from that? And then that's when, concepts like the circular economy, how do we how can we meet everyone's needs and the needs of the world and its ecosystems in a way where everyone can thrive and not have it be a zero-sum game.
Okay, so speaking about no zero-sum game and talking about a circular economy, let's delve a little deeper into that concept. We've seen the circular economy in particular really highlighted, and that happened pretty much around the time when the pandemic lockdowns began globally. Naturally, because of global lockdowns, we were emitting a lot fewer greenhouse gases. But at the same time, now that everything is pretty much open and back to so-called normal, everything has shot all the way back up, especially emissions. So let's talk about the circular economy. What is it in essence, Melissa?
There are a few pillars to it. And the renewable transition is a part of it, but it underpins these other three parts, which is to design out waste, to keep materials in use, and then to regenerate our lands. We cannot just look at renewables alone. And that's kind of like the push around the world as well. Because I think when it comes to measurable impact and things that are easy to measure, that's when we focus on net zero, on the carbon economy, on here's how much greenhouse gas I'm emitting, and then this is how I brought it down to zero. But we're forgetting all the other three parts. So I think the stat that I usually like to refer to is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is if you were just to look at greenhouse gas emissions, that actually takes care of only 55% of our current emissions.
Right, fair enough. Just a little bit above half.
Just a little bit above half. But the other 45% is actually all those three other factors. And with all the challenges of moving to renewables, which again, a lot of countries and councils and cities and companies have done a lot of progress in, there's still a lot of friction because now you're trying to move the system into a renewable one, but you cannot forget the other three factors because the values that drive those other three factors will be the ones that will reduce the demand of renewables in the first place. If you were to just go full force renewables, you're going to create a lot of knock-on effects that would not be pretty, and we don't want to create new problems by solving the current problems that we have, especially if we're going into it with the same mindset.
Exactly. So we'll go a little bit deeper into that in a while, but at the same time, if we could now focus on how stringent do you feel are Malaysia's current government regulations on environmental protection? Let's perhaps just focus on home state area, Selangor Klang Valley. Of course, we introduced recyclable plastic bags, for example, a couple of years ago. But at the same time, is this sufficient? What more could be done from a climate action perspective?
I guess that itself is a very tricky question already, especially when it comes to us knowing that laws and policies, the effectiveness of them it highly depends on not whether they exist, but how they are implemented then enforced.
And also whether or not I think we as individual citizens are receptive to it, whether it becomes part of our daily routine rather than becoming, let's say, a chore, right?
Yeah, because what we want to do is actually change the culture. If we try and put band-aids over big gaping wounds, that's really not going to cut it or not going to help us achieve our goals. For example, I think if I were to think about, for me as a citizen, getting excited about all these new policies that are coming into place and then watching them unfold in the way that they're implemented can be quite disappointing, but can also be very confusing for the general public. Because then people will say, oh, when it comes to acting in the interest of the environment and ourselves, it is something that you can do halfway or can say that you're doing but not actually do it.
Optional, not
It is
essential.
optional.
Yeah,
right.
okay.
And that doesn't really reinforce the change that we want to see. So a couple of things I can think about is how I was excited about mandatory waste segregation for households in Selangor and several other states. And then to not actually watch that, for me at least, it looks like it wasn't or was, or in bits and pieces enforced here and there. So again, that really doesn't reinforce the culture. Seeing things like polystyrene bans and then still seeing polystyrene all over the place, or seeing initiatives like no plastic straws with big stickers and big posters everywhere, but then right in front of it is all the straws. So this is very confusing for any citizen, because then it just shows that, oh, this doesn't need to be taken seriously.
Or it's not 100% through and through sustainable or actually renewable. I love the fact that you gave an example of, you know, plastic stickers and other materials that are non-recyclable immediately being used to advertise that, well, hey, we've got, you know, paper straws. But also, for example, paper straws may even come wrapped up in certain plastics, which could actually be harmful to the health if you drink hot drinks through them, etc. Okay, so from there, moving on, let's have a look at the fact that when it comes to our personal consumer choices as well, we are definitely experiencing one of the hotter years on record now. Last year was also extremely warm. And at the same time, you see the fact that the monsoon will be either out of season or much, much heavier than usual. That usually leads us to far heavier energy consumption when it comes to just the household. For example, keeping your aircon on all the time. So what would be your argument in the face of very practical realities for the average person who might be like, yeah, well, of course I do care about the environment. I am concerned that it's so much hotter, but for personal comfort and other reasons, I am going to be using this aircon for 12, 13 hours a day.
It is definitely a vicious negative feedback loop. The hotter it gets, the more you're also contributing to the state of the climate crisis. I guess in that sense, you have to really look at the way, understand that it's actually not just about how much can I sacrifice, but how can I redesign the way I do things and the way I live so that it benefits me. So for example, it might not be about me turning off my air conditioning and going off the fan. It might be me if I was in a renting situation, for example. Me moving to a place where it is conducive for me to not even turn on the air conditioning. So for example, I live in a space where, you know, I'm able to use natural airflow, work ventilation, work in certain areas of the room so that I don't actually need to use the air conditioner. Also understanding that each of us have a responsibility and influence to impact the world around us. So our influence isn't just limited to our personal decisions, because our personal decisions in all the roles that we play have a ripple effect outwards into the world that can go lower carbon, and we're going to do it collectively. So each individual is in a family, and each individual is an employee somewhere or an employer somewhere, where they can create change through all these practices, through noticing all these opportunities for us to reduce carbon, reduce waste, reduce consumption, reduce production, and then watch that kind of amplify just from all these little choices. So I think that's where I think I would really like to invite people to start noticing where they can create influence and not just sitting back and saying, oh, I have no choice, I have to turn on my air conditioning. Well, that's completely fine. But if you do, why not start acting on all those opportunities? You might end up becoming net zero yourself.
Yeah, look at perhaps other areas in your life that are negotiable rather than maybe one big chunk that is non-negotiable, right?
Exactly. There's a lot of opportunity for us to do it. It's not just about kind of lifting our hands up and saying, oh, I can't do something about it.
Exactly. So looking at the wider landscape of Malaysia as a country and moving into a different discussion area, right? We've got, of course, our National Energy Transition Roadmap, the NETR, which basically states that we've got net zero goals by 2050. So that's a little over 24, 25 years away, which honestly, it does after all fly by. But one core part that is lacking really would be bridging public awareness. So in your perspective and in the experiences that you've had over the past decade or so, where do you think would be the most crucial, perhaps, age group to have interventions? Or do you actually think interventions are possible and necessary across the life cycle?
Oh, definitely everyone needs to be included in this process. I think there is a lot of burden on the youth and saying that they will solve the problem.
Plus climate anxiety, right? Because you're so aware of everything that's been happening.
Absolutely. But it does need change at every level, at every generation. So I think the most obvious one is obviously better climate education to help people draw the correlation, connection between the things that they do, the choices that they make every day, and how does that translate into how it impacts the world around them. And then you do that at every level. So putting in climate programs for school kids, for and kind of not reinventing the wheel on that as well, because there are a lot of really strong programs locally run by nonprofits, and as well as tapping into the global network and their climate programs, so that now every Malaysian citizen is an active, is a climate advocate, someone who's taking climate action. So you need to empower people with knowledge and then to also create the environment for that knowledge to be practiced. So introducing it to them, then integrating it for them, reinforcing it for them, so that now each of us are creating a culture shift collectively to be able to achieve and help the government and other and all the industries to support the supply with the demand and have the demand also influence the supply.
And I think a very practical perhaps explanation for that could be the way in which if you're making, say, more conscious decisions as a consumer when you're doing your weekly shopping trips for groceries and other essentials, if more of us make those conscious choices, that generally scales back and rolls back into the providers, the wholesalers, the retailers, recognizing it, right?
Absolutely. We can create a positive feedback loop, but it does need to have intentional choices behind it, and then to incentivize those choices as well.
Right. So speaking about intentional choices and incentivizing, Melissa, so I have to ask you about this though. When it comes to, of course, private individuals or even, smaller companies, etc., doing a lot, especially over the past 5 to 7 years, when it comes to climate action and trying to be as zero waste as possible. And then that's always perhaps outweighed almost on a perspective looking at the destructive ecological footprint of the elite folks in the world. I'm talking about private jets, which belong to, not just celebrities, but other singers, etc. But how do you actually reconcile yourself with continuing the baby steps or the daily steps that you are taking as an individual consumer?
I think when you continue to show up, you form a part of the culture. So even if you don't, if you don't show up, that's one link in the chain that is broken.
Sure.
As you form the chain, that's when other people form the chain with you. So you have to you will see the effects that it brings into your life. For example, better mental health, better well-being overall, as well as the change that you impact around you. When you start seeing the links of the chain be built, now we're seeing this culture shift even online. For example, celebrities,
they get called out.
They get
quite
called
a lot.
out.
Yeah,
which would have never happened before. But for that to have happened, it had several years of this momentum building up, of this awareness building up, of this shift building up. And then for us to continuously reinforce and then build that shift up so that we will see that place where the wealthy don't also get away with it, and that they are a part of that conversation and a part of that change. Because in the end, you know, they are icons, they are people that other people, that the general public looks up to, and what they do to set the tone matters a lot in how people follow through. Now we're seeing even more celebrities that are living environmental values, that are going vegan, that are going plant-based, that are using their platforms to build platforms for people to join them in the movement. So that number is already growing, and that can only happen when this continuous positive feedback loop happens.
Sure, exactly. It's not all bad out there, right? So speaking about the corporate side of things, right? On the flip side, there's a total of nearly 6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions, which were produced by 100 companies or entities in the US in 2020 alone. And this is according to latest research. So some of the top polluting companies also have facilities and communities that have, for example, historically faced environmental as well as health injustices. What more, in your perspective, can be done so that organizations, especially corporate organizations, have more commitment towards climate action? Perhaps if you have any even local examples that you might be able to share.
The example that I usually like to share is Patagonia. So I would highly recommend anyone to read the founder's book. It really draws out like what does it mean to have a business where its purpose is for good, and how that business can make a lot of money. Because Patagonia really proves that when you are driven by your values, you know, you can build $1 billion company as well. They are not perfect, not by any means, but being guided by those values led them to, you know, achieve so much more in changing the business landscape and setting the example for other fashion brands to be able to really set higher standards for themselves, rather than looking at the market and saying, what can I get away with so I look as good as I can?
Fair.
So then it's really coming back to the root of, why is this business here? How is it serving society, other than just profit maximization?
Exactly. So when we're speaking about, you know, our profit maximization, let's also look at another sphere of overconsumption, which is definitely fast fashion. Tell me a little bit about your work in the arena of actually reversing that tide, or also contributing to genuine recycling of the overabundance, really, of waste that we create with our consumption of fast fashion.
So I think fast fashion is a really great example, similar to plastic, of what it means to not create a problem, preventing a problem before it happens, instead of trying to solve a problem which is really quite complicated to solve. For example, you brought up recycling. The global recycling rate for textiles is 1%.
1%.
It's
okay, so let's say you've got 100 pieces of clothing here, just one of those is actually going to get properly recycled.
And what you will see
That's
is
staggering.
a lot of people resorting to recycling in order to kind of allay the guilt of all this consumption and waste that they're
Clear
creating.
out the closet, etc.
Exactly. But again, what we need is a culture and mindset shift instead of putting band-aids on gaping wounds. When you know the stat that is only 1%, because the technology itself isn't scalable at the moment. And with fiber being all mixed together in multiple different ways, it is really hard to recycle, you know, the majority of textiles that are produced out there. So what we need to do is look at the way that we consume, the way that we produce, and going back to the source. So that's where, you know, things like extended producer responsibility comes in, where countries now have to kind of set up their systems and introduce legislation so that companies themselves are responsible for the things that they put out, rather than putting it out there and then letting the everyone else bear the brunt of it.
Nonetheless, it's actually better to be consuming less rather than trying to worry about whether everything is going to get recycled, because I do want everyone to remember that number.
Yes.
Only 1% of every 100 pieces of clothing actually gets recycled. All right,
and
that's just mind-blowing. Okay, Melissa, so moving into perhaps one last area of discussion before we close out, we also are definitely having one of the highest rates of per capita private vehicle ownership in the region. More than 40% of our nation's total energy consumption actually comes from transport.
Yeah.
So do you feel that the governmental push for EVs or electric vehicles is the way forward? Or perhaps should we also explore ways to develop beyond our current car centrism, looking more at public transport systems perhaps?
Absolutely. Everyone is facing the pressure of going carbon neutral. But we tend to forget that low carbon mobility is not synonymous with EVs. EV is only part of the puzzle of low carbon mobility. And again, when it comes to accessibility of EVs, you know, there's the price factor, there's the fact that we're still in the midst of building out our charging network, there's the charging times, there's the environmental costs of building out, of even producing EVs. All these factors have to be taken into consideration. So when we look at low carbon mobility, it should not be from one lens, which is economically juicy, especially for car manufacturers, but all those other factors, more pedestrian friendly cities, more better connectivity, more trees so that people actually want to walk, more sidewalks, bike friendly cities, better public transportation, etc., etc., etc. There are so many factors, and it does not have to stop at EV. In fact, it cannot stop at EV because this kind of blocks out the majority of Malaysians who are not able to afford EVs and would then exclude themselves from the climate conversation, from taking climate action itself, when they are already the ones that are creating the least carbon compared to everyone else.
Sure, fantastic. Yeah. Melissa, we really could go on, but that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Well, this has been Niaga Spotlight with me, Tehmina Kaoosji. We'll, of course, be back again next Friday with more business analysis and insights. Here's to a productive week ahead.